Good afternoon and welcome to the Fall 2019 semester of Records Management University. We are broadcasting live from Fife Media Studios in historic Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll be getting started in just a moment. My name is Chris Petty, your Dean of Admissions and co-host of RMU, and have a few housekeeping items for you before we begin. Because of our awesome turnout, we'll need to mute your phones and computer mics to avoid picking up any feedback or noise. If you have a question, please use the chat window located in the bottom right of the screen. I'll be monitoring the chat session and will respond directly, or if relevant to the discussion, we'll have Dean Mitch address it. Over the next few days, you'll receive an email on how to receive a copy of today's recording, as well as other instructions on all things RMU, including credits and certifications. To those wishing to receive credits for RMU, information about them will be handed out at the end of this semester. To our students viewing this on demand, the credits do count just as much as viewing it live, although we do enjoy the live chat discussions. As you know, RMU is certified by the Institute of Certified Records Managers, and it is worth one official credit qualifying course worth one certification maintenance point per class towards your recertification. To receive a pre-approval code for ICRM credits from Fife, you must attend all 5 classes live or listen to all of the recorded sessions. If you aren't able to participate in all 5 classes, you can still receive ICRM credits, but you'll need to submit your own justification. Additionally, RMU is certified with the Association for Information and Image Management, or AIM. You can receive certified information professional credits from AIM by your participation in the live or recorded sessions. And so, without further ado, I'm handing the wheel over to Mitch Farbstein, our esteemed and spooktacular Dean of RMU. Mitch, take it away.
All right, Chris, thank you. It's always a pleasure to be here. You can see I'm getting into the Halloween spirit.
Absolutely. It's only 2 days away.
Only 2 days away. And it also, with the hat, could be also interpreted as a pilgrim hat, so I can get ready for Thanksgiving as well.
That's right. That's right. keeping with the hats.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, let's go deep dive into the 4th class of the 10th semester. And as the folks who have been attending the class, or if you're new, our theme this semester is psychiatrists and psychologists. And there's an absolute reason why, because we all, as records managers and partaking in records management, definitely need our heads examined in this day and age with all the different things that you have to manage as a records manager. Okay, so the 4th class, we are talking about we need to quickly meet a government mandate for email. So as you may or may not remember, I think you do, that each of these classes is based on an actual implementation that has been done and that I've been involved in. And that's why I'm fairly knowledgeable about the discussions for each of these customers. And we go through each of these customers or implementations and take a critical eye and look at what they went through, because I think it's important to have the ability to share these experiences with different records managers who may not have had the opportunity to implement multiple records management systems. I'm not sure that's an opportunity or not, but it's because it's a lot of work. So here we are with the usual, why does Dean Mitch hate records management? We are analysis session number 4, and it has to do with electronic messages. And my issue is handling all this email and chain threads. Chain threads are, you have emails and, you go back and forth and back and forth. That's a continuing thread, and that will be the death of me yet. And the reason is this. I get about 200 electronic messages each day. That's just at work. Forget about, my personal stuff. Then I've saved about 200,000 business emails over the last 25 years. I've deleted about 450,000 of them. And people say, why do you keep emails for 25 years? Are they permanent or whatever? For me, they're permanent because a lot of the emails has to do with business relationships that I have with our customers. So I do need to keep them because a lot of times those organizations change and they look for a history of what took place in the account. So I'm saddled with keeping those forever, almost. I keep everything since there are customers of 20 years or longer. And so I don't really have an event disposition per se. 250 folders to drag and drop emails into. So that's how I do it. And I wouldn't suggest that from a records management perspective, because what we'll talk about later on is the idea of journaling emails into the system and automatically capture it without my intervention in terms of categorizing those emails. 5, discerning between email archiving and email records management. We'll talk a little bit later about that, but they are two distinct approaches to managing your email. And 6, when should the life cycle end? Okay, when is the end of your storing all these emails, like I've been saying, in terms of mine's not 25 years. Mine, if I last another 40 years here, they're going to be 65-year-old emails. Okay, so that brings us to our therapist du jour. And today we have Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was born in Zurich, Switzerland. And she was an American-Swiss psychiatrist. So she moved to the States, I think around the 1940s. I don't remember exactly. Probably a little later, because she went to the University of Zurich Medical School. As I mentioned before, to be a psychiatrist, you have to have a medical degree versus a psychologist, which does not. She focused on the psychology of near-death experiences, dying and death. Very exciting topic. The cool thing about death is nobody avoids it, so we all have something to look forward to as we get older. Just like old records, eventually they will die off as well in most cases. Published on Death and Dying in 1969 on 5 stages of grief, and they were denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Co-founded the American Holistic Medical Association and conducted many worldwide workshops on AIDS. So she's really was one of the foremost authorities on this whole process of encountering death, accepting its terms, and basically eventually dying. So today's malady is thanatophobia. Okay, say that 3 times fast, which is basically the fear of death. So, and there's different fears that you have about death. There could be predatory death anxiety, and that's the fight or flight thing. When you encounter something that threatens you, do you run? Do you encounter it and try to control it? Predation is manifest as unconscious guilt. That is if somebody has killed somebody, you have this guilt that you carry on. So that's a fear of death in itself too, because you've caused that death. Existential, basically that's the end of one's life cycle or mortality, which obviously a lot of people contemplate. Religions have a different way of looking at it. And in the role of eschatology, it's the end of the world. You know, what happens when you die? And different religions have a different view on that in terms of what happens to if there is a real soul. And if you look at death, anxiety is most prevalent about death in 20 to 40 year range. It's almost like records management. You know, the first time you get into records management, you have a great deal of anxiety about it. And it's like, you know, you're very scared of it, right? Then between the ages of 40 and 64, the death anxiety peaks. And you get to a point where you're saying in your later days that the death anxiety really slumps off. You're not scared of it anymore. And I can attest to this. You know, I'm in that range. I'm not close to 125 yet, but I'm above 65. And you really don't worry about it anymore. It's kind of weird. And so this is our malady for today. And what we find is that everything goes through these kind of birth, life, and death cycles. Basically, everything in the universe other than matter and energy, once it was created, it never goes away. So that brings us to the information life cycle. And so if everything has a life cycle, so does records. And so if we look at the beginning of the information life cycle, it's really understanding your inventory, understanding where it's captured or how it's generated, and then moving it along its next step, which is kind of a process, a life process. And some of the things that attribute to that life process and maybe redirects it, makes it different, would be things like e-discovery and task management, declassification, those kinds of activities that work with the records that you have. And then thirdly, you have obviously records management and the control of the information from a permanency to a retention to a disposition. So if you look at the real flow of this, you have data that's born, you have data then has a life, and then you have data that's a death. So you follow that until the Big Bang, or well, this is actually the big collapse in the future, and everything goes away. So even though it's permanent, it's not permanent. All right. So now we get into the heart of today's presentation. As we've done in the other classes, we look from a psychological analysis, and we go through what is the records management aberration, which is the exploration. Why does the records management aberration exist? So there's an analysis that takes place. Who can help the organization become records management normal, whatever that means, because there is no normal approach to records management. There's good ways, bad ways, but there's no way that everybody can adhere to that will make sure that their records management program is successful. And what are the available records management analysis protocols? What kind of things can you go through to ensure that you are doing proper records management and being successful? Where are the records management corrective actions to be taken? And how's records management patient progressing? What is the end result? And there's never an end to your records management program because there's always changes that are going to take place based on regulations, based on what has happened with records in the past that weren't able to be discovered for a legal case. So you're always changing and modifying your records management program. So today's theme, or today's what would I call it? Basically, the example is for federal customers, the mandate for managing emails. There's the exploration, analysis, corrective actions, and resolution. So we'll start with exploration. All right, so for this particular implementation, they didn't have a set number of email boxes that they had to consider. It changes because their business changes every couple of years, and so they're getting to a high peak time frame in terms of how they run their business or their organization. And so it could be anywhere from 15,000 to 55,000 mailboxes over a couple year period. And it's in effect elastic because it'll go up and it'll go down, and it'll go up and go down. And so we had to accommodate that in terms of determining how much storage was required, how much throughput was required, because we're doing various exercises on each of these emails, and which what we talked about before, and I'll go into that a little bit more. So it was a federal civilian agency, and that's why they were under the federal mandate. Most commercial organizations don't have to worry about those mandates, but there are policies from the information governance team that should have a time frame in terms of when you would hopefully get to a success point that's protecting the organization and mitigating potential risk in terms of lawsuits or just any other type of information management that you need. A lot of these emails had very highly sensitive information, and they had to be, conscientious that the permissions are set on it properly, that this information wasn't lost or deleted by the users. To be implemented in an Amazon cloud, we've talked about this before. A lot of organizations, both commercial, federal, public, are going to the cloud. It's just IT wise, it's just much easier to manage in that environment. Now, the real question is always security and having your information stored outside of your physical buildings. And so a lot of organizations are still wrestling with that, but we see a tremendous movement toward the cloud environment. And this is what this organization wanted to do. And they use Amazon. They could have used Azure. They could have used Oracle's cloud. There's several other ones that create that offer that infrastructure. Had a backlog of email to be captured. So as I mentioned, they didn't get started until after the end of the mandate, which was 2016. So they were saving all these emails, not in their Exchange server at that time, or it could be, Google Mail, whatever you have. And they created these huge, what they call PST files. Okay, they just take thousands and thousands of emails and compress them into a singular file. And so they would store that because that's easier to store. But in the PST state, it's harder to get at all those emails, and a lot of times they're kept at the user's desktop, so they can take it out of their Outlook files. Stored emails cannot contain any PII, personally identifiable information. We see more and more of this all the time, and so they had to prevent PII from being in the email after it's received to the records management repository. And it required an ATO or authority to operate certificate to move to production. We see this a lot in the federal government, where these systems have to be put on maybe a test server or development server or an integration server first, and make sure that all the proper security is there, the protocols of access, the permissions, and so on is there before they can even move into production. We see this also falling into the commercial world, or the commercial world in a lot of different areas. But one in particular, the pharma world, is very conscientious of this, and they have a lot of protocols that have to be reviewed before systems go into production. It's not really much different. It also dictates how much documentation is required, so you're self-sustaining of the system. But these things are becoming more and more important, especially as we move into this whole cyber world and cybersecurity world. These systems are vetted over and over and over, and every time you do upgrades and so on, they have to be checked. So that's what the ATO certificate is, and it adds a layer of work on any implementation. Okay. So then we get into the analysis part of it. So, we had the kind of exploration. We kind of understood what needed to be done on a general basis. And there was more discovery during the exploration than what I presented here, because these are big projects, obviously, with, 55,000 email boxes. And there's some organizations, the Army, big corporations that have hundreds of thousands of email boxes. So in the analysis, we found that they do about 400,000 to 1.4 million emails daily. It's a lot of volume. It's a lot of emails to be looked at. Nobody's sitting there at their desk and categorizing all these emails, and nobody's doing it for you either. So in looking at this number, if you divide it by a normal 250 days in a year, that's a lot of emails on an annual basis. And so you need the infrastructure, both external to your records management system, let's say your Exchange servers or your Google servers, to be able to handle this much mail. But remember, when you're bringing mail in, there's also a copy somewhere else. And we'll talk about journaling in a few minutes, or archiving, that you have really a duplicate of the emails and the attachments and everything else, and there's ways of reducing that. So a big part of what we have found in implementing systems is trying to figure out, how do you manage these kinds of volumes of emails? It's not easy. There's no trick to figuring it out, other than doing some testing and finding out what's the average size of an email that somebody's distributing. Okay. So configuring the system to adjust mailboxes on an annual basis. So I told you that, they can grow, they can shrink, and everything else. This is where the idea of the cloud comes in, because the cloud can grow and shrink the amount of space, and grow and shrink in the number of servers, and the horsepower of it too. Well, we just changed something. Anyway, the sound just, how are you hearing it, Chris? Are you okay?
Yeah, I still hear.
Okay.
Folks on the line still hear okay?
We good?
Yep, everyone hears
okay,
right.
except for me. I'm telling you.
I
uh,
it is Halloween, right?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
but
Okay.
everyone online can hear very
Okay,
clear.
good, good, excellent. It's more important you hear than I hear. So on an annual basis, we have to make an adjustment, and they don't want to pay for more horsepower and more storage than they needed. So we had to kind of come up with an algorithm to address that. Capture metadata and full text. So it wasn't just capturing the to, from, subject, and date. We had to capture all the full text, and the full text included the thread or the content in the email directly. It included the attachments, a Word document, a PDF, that also we needed to strip the full text out. And as you go down that path, you recognize you need more and more horsepower to both capture it, but when people are doing e-discovery on that content, they're freezing it, they are doing other activities on that content and moving it around, then there's still more horsepower that needs to be there. So we always get asked this question, well, how many servers do I need? And how much storage do I need? And et cetera, et cetera. It's somewhat of a guessing game. You can go by experience, but as I mentioned before, every organization is different. So there's no actual standard. It's just figuring out by sampling how much you have. And that's what happens when you put the system initially, like when I talked about ATO, you put it on the development server, you put it on a test server, you start allowing content to flow into the system. So you have an idea of what to do. And then after you do that, then you can really start configuring your production servers. Establish rules for capstone officials. In this particular case, because it's a federal organization, they were under the guise of the National Archives, and they can use this capstone approach where they identify certain officials, high-level officials in the organization, and those are the emails that they have to capture on a permanent basis. And the challenge there is that capstone officials change. One day you're a capstone official, OFFIIC. Oh wow! Now that was my mistake. There's no ghost that did that.
I say there's a ghost, Mitch.
Okay, all right. You're kind to me, Chris. So establishing the rules for capstone officials that change all the time and getting that basically certified by NARA, takes some time. It should be done before you start trying to actually implement the system, because you want to try to get test emails coming in and making sure your capstone officials are recognized at that point. They elected to go with the internal cloud infrastructure. So when they were initially doing this, they were going to go with an Amazon cloud and AWS, and then they decide no, they're going to do an internal cloud, which you can do. An internal cloud is okay. You should say okay, that's an on-premises system. It really isn't, because the architecture of it is different than what typical on-premises systems tend to be. The emails to transfer to the National Archives. What NARA said was, do not give me emails that have PII in it. So that's a challenge, because these emails are flowing in from the Exchange servers in this particular case. And so when these emails come in, who's looking at it before it becomes a record? And as the emails flow into the system, and if you do what they call envelope journaling, which is just the Exchange server just sends a copy to your records management archive, or not, on your repository, and there's probably PII in it, which could be somebody's social security number, somebody's name, somebody's address, and there's a whole bunch of these little PIIs running around out there. They're like little ghosts running around, and you need to control that, and that's a headache for everybody. And they're required to get an authority to operate network certificate. So we had to start working on that. That included a lot of documentation, from Fife, a lot of documentation internally. It's really a collaborative effort to get this ATO or some other certificate or some other blessing that the system now can go into production. So this is all before we've even gotten to production, all the exploration, all the analysis, and then we get into the corrective actions as we're preparing to go into this productive state. So we decided, let's just do a big bucket approach. And the big bucket really narrows down the number of categories that you need. And you've heard me say this over and over. If there's new people on here or the old people, I apologize for repeating this. But what we have seen is that people who have to produce records, either a congressional inquiry, an FDA inquiry about a drug, or just a legal inquiry, you're not searching this totally based on the category of the records, right? And you rely more on this full text thing that I mentioned earlier on. So we decided there's a permanent thing which we needed for the capstone officials, and then we said, okay, let's just do 15 years for emails that aren't permanent, and then you have transitory emails that are, they're not really records, or what I'll talk about, probable non-records in a few minutes. So what we wanted to do is, so we had the big bucket, the three categories. It's easy to manage at that level. Installed on-ramp servers, eliminating Exchange server throttling. What I mean by that is, because of their volumes, we wanted to be able to, when the emails were journaled to the solution, we needed more than one server that would take it, strip out the metadata, strip out the full text, and prepare it to go into the repository, to store it in the repository. So what we also didn't want to do is throttle the Exchange server, meaning that when you do journaling, okay, you don't want your Exchange server to stop, to be overwhelmed, because once you do that, then you're affecting everybody else from getting their emails, in this particular case, getting them into Outlook. You don't want to overburden your Exchange servers, or you don't have to force them to buy bigger Exchange servers. So what we do is we have little tiny servers that sit out there that are load balanced, and we call them on-ramp servers, and they protect the process of the Exchange servers pushing the emails out.
A question from our audience, Dean
Yeah.
Mitch. What do we mean when we say throttling? Can you explain that a little bit more?
Throttling is like a governor, or if you, it comes basically from cars. Okay, you have a throttle on there that controls how much, as I remember about cars from years ago, the gas and the air flow, and the mixture of that, and you don't want to throttle that. You don't want to, cut out your gas while you're going 60 miles an hour, or the air that's in there as well. So throttling basically says, I'm backed up. You can think of other ways you're backed up, but that's kind of what throttling is. It's getting backed up where you can't perform as effectively or efficiently as you would like to.
Okay, great.
Good question.
Thank you.
Auto-categorization emails using a capstone definition. So we created the definitions. How did we find who's the capstone officials, who's not a capstone official? And so we would look at the email, and based on who you are, we could say in the to line, okay, or the from line, you can take both of those and you can determine these are capstone officials. So these emails, quote unquote, are more important than the other emails. I'm not sure that's always true. They can have junk in them, or you can have a scientist that comes up with something that is part of a drug development, and sometimes that's more important. But these are the complex things that are looked at in terms of defining who your capstone officials are, particularly in the federal government. But a lot of commercial organizations are going to this too, and basing it, because it's easier to do it this way than figure out every email and every category for it. Let's capstone, let's save their stuff permanently, and we should be fairly safe. Email cleaned up using a probable non-records model. So what happens here is we look at the content, and we also look at the metadata, or the to from subject information, and we determine in an auto-categorization way whether these are really records that you need to keep, or they're transitory records where you can just get rid of them in a short period of time. So here's an example. I send Chris an email. I say, "Hey, Chris, let's go let's go to the baseball game tomorrow night, okay? And since he's down near Washington D.C.,
Go Nats.
it's a good bet he'd want to go. Although he's probably a Baltimore.
I am an O's fan,
proponent.
unfortunately this season.
this that's why I was Phillies. But anyway, so these probable non-recs are things you don't want to save. You just want to get rid of them, okay? And there's steps and rules that you can apply to get rid of these transitory records because it can take up a lot of space and a lot of time. The backfile reprocessing of emails back to 12/31/16 for compliance. So if they wanted to meet the federal mandate, emails that are old, okay, before this particular date, they needed to reprocess. So when these PST files came in, or if there's older stuff that were sitting in Exchange, when they came in, we can backdate it and start the records back to then. And that helped them a lot to reach compliance. Application connectivity permissions addressed. As a corrective action, what you run into in most organizations is to implement or install the application. They have different connectors or ports, whatever you want to call it, and you have to have certain permissions to allow the software to talk to itself or to talk externally. And so this is a big challenge within a lot of organizations. This particular organization, I think it took us almost 6 months to actually get all the permissions set up because that's really reliant on the internal IT environment. So if you're part of an implementation, the only reason I mentioned is it's kind of an IT education component. Just be aware that when people are saying, well, it's probably about 2 months to implement the system, this has to be considered because this is one of the biggest obstacles in terms of getting implementations done in a reasonable time frame. And then finally took advantage of their front-end Exchange PII recognition filter. So in this particular case, they could have sent every email into us and we would have found the PII, we would have quarantined it, isolated it, and then somebody would have to make a decision on what to do. In this particular customer's case, they had a product, a piece of software that sat on their Exchange server. So it was interrogated at that level. And they can block all of the emails and quarantine them on the Exchange server, which takes up space, but they can do that. And any email that had PII in it never was sent to Fife, which was fine with us because otherwise we would have to have processed that. And if they can block that and know at that point how much they're getting in terms of PII, that was a much better approach. So we kind of lucked out in that respect. Okay, and then we come to the resolution. So what did we do to really get to, getting them into processing? So we configured the infrastructure to initially process 500,000 emails daily, based on those numbers I presented earlier on. And we're able to do that with, I think we used maybe 4 or 5 of these on-ramp servers to be able to control that. We achieved 40% reduction of transient or probable non-record emails. So 40% of the emails that were coming into the organization were junk. They didn't need to keep it. I think as I remember, they elected to keep it for 90 days and then purge it every 90 days. So that reduced the amount of processing that was required and obviously the amount of storage that was necessary. Created dynamic dashboards and static reports for all email activity. So we use these dashboards and static reports to report on the percentages of transient records, the percentages of capstone records, and the percentage of non-permanent records, but important records. So they could look at that and they can see the balance and they can see as they grow the system and shrink the system, how is that changing to do some prediction in terms of what they're going to need for storage in the future. Oh, I got them out of order. That's all right. Let's pop the next one here. Go back to that. Took advantage of the front-end Exchange PII recognition filter, as I mentioned in the last slide. Position to transfer emails to NARA. So they now are in a position based on their transfer of pretty much 15 years on the emails. to move to NARA. So it can be packaged up. It sets it through the disposition scheduling and prepares it to go to NAR. So that was all set up in an automatic way. And then the next steps for them was they have a lot of other content, including social media. And what they wanted to do is not have multiple file plans or record schedules or categories for electronic other kinds of electronic content versus the emails. And so we allowed them to use the same categories and file plan or record schedule for the emails and for the incoming objects. They could also apply that if they ever wanted to do physical records as well. So that was the resolution, and today they're processing and moving forward. Okay, any questions at this point, Chris? Anything pop up?
So one person asked, does this apply to the intelligence committee? I think that maybe they meant community.
The intelligence community? Is that the?
Yeah, that's the question.
That's an interesting question. The intelligence community, obviously, you can apply most of the same guidelines that we went through with them. The vetting is a lot stricter when I talked about the ATL. And what you find is that in the intelligence community and a lot in DoD, you will have multiple networks. And in that particular case, you have, and I won't get into too much detail of this, there's things called JWICs, which is a very high level secure network. There's the SIPRnet, which is basically considered the secret network. So access is very restricted there, higher restrictions on JWICs. And then you have the NIPRnet, which is kind of the public version of it. And so certain organizations in the IC or in DoD and some other, the DOE, they have these different networks and they have exchange servers feeding these different networks. And so you have things to consider called the high side, the low side, and typically things don't move dynamically between the two. They have to be positioned and then that information can be moved. So you can have a situation where you have certain emails on the SIPR side and certain emails on the NIPR side. So when you're doing an e-discovery, you have to do them in both, unless you have tools, and there are tools that can move stuff between the two or three environments.
Right.
Hopefully that answered how that applies to the IC.
Yes, and it was community.
Oh, it was?
Yeah, the intelligence community.
Yeah, okay, good.
And then one other question, was the agency concerned, the one that we're talking about, was it concerned with keeping all emails at capstone level permanently in terms when considering legal discovery?
Well, the notion of capstone is you keep them permanently, okay, and you accession them or transfer them over to NARA, and they will have them at a certain period of time. So yeah, and then the other stuff is transitory, and they can decide, when to just delete them at that point. But again, it gets back to my thing about emails. When does an email no longer have value?
Mm-hmm.
And it could have value in terms of how you do your business, but what you're trying to do with getting rid of emails is the risk of litigation. That's the big difference. And as I've talked about before, records are kept for various reasons. One of them is historical, another one's for research, another one is basically for risk mitigation. And so that's what you need to consider in terms of your organization, what your organization does, and what kind of information you need to declare it as that you need it as a permanent type of record.
Right. It's really going to vary from organization to organization.
That's everything that we talk about does do that. And so what I talk about with this organization, half of it may not apply to your organization, all of it may apply, but this is why we try to give you a broad stroke presentation of different things that we've experienced. So maybe it fits somewhere in your organization, and maybe it doesn't, but it's very hard to cover everything exactly for what you need in your organization.
And one last question along emails here. Should it be up to individual users to move their emails to a repository, or should that be automated?
That should absolutely be automated. And this is the notion of particularly in emails, email envelope journaling.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you don't want the users to be me. You don't want your users to try to figure out categorization. I drop things in folders. Most of those folders, are related to the content, but I'm not doing true records management. I'm not categorizing them in the folder, and that takes a lot of time. And you're dependent on the user keeping the email and not deleting the email, even though it's in your Exchange server. But once the Exchange server purges and you've purged it out of your own email Outlook box, that's gone. Okay, it might be on a backup tape somewhere, but generally it's considered gone. What you want to do is this notion of envelope journaling, where as soon as the email comes into your Exchange server, it will be journaled, it will be sent, it will be forwarded, okay, directly to your records repository. And to do that, though, you need to basically have a simplified mail server on that end to receive it. And I'm going to talk about email archiving versus email records management in a minute, and I'll kind of explain that a little bit more in detail. I want to try to get most of this done because some people are not interested in that's for a little bit further down in the process here.
Okay, great.
Okay, so we've done a consciousness checklist each class. So now we're down to the fourth one. Have I established realistic records management goals and evaluation tools to measure achievement? How do you know you're successful? So on this one, I'm going to talk about tools and measurement achievement. Have I, meaning you, okay, defined 3 main goals for the records management program for the current year? Not 10 goals, not 100 goals, but simplify it. 3. What are 3 things you want to accomplish this year in your records management program? Expand it, get more inventory under control. And I mean inventory from different systems or physical records and electronic records, or just emails to start out with. What are your goals? And if you don't have a goal, you don't have anything to measure yourself against, or your part of the organization. Do I have forward-looking plan for 2 to 5 years out? You can't end in this year. Okay. Records management in general is about long-term goals, storing stuff for 10, 15, 75 years. All right. Moving stuff to other repositories. What is my plan? If you think about even looking at how much volume you have, remember, eventually, unless you're doing acquisitions, you're going to reach a steady state, or you should reach a steady state, where the amount of emails or electronic documents, not so much physical records, that you have will eventually reach this steady state where stuff's coming in, but you're also disposing of records. So you get to the point where your storage is not growing just keep growing forever. It should get to this steady state. And it's another thing that needs to be considered in terms of your goals. So do you have a forward-looking plan for 2 to 5 years out? You should really look further, but that's a stretch for a lot of us at this point. Have I created or produced an objective measurement tool of success? So when I sit down and I say, okay, these are the objectives that I'm trying to reach, and if I reach all of these, I've been very successful. If I reached 80% of it, I'm still being successful because I've done something, I've changed something. If you're doing like 1%, you're probably not. Either your goals are unrealistic, your objectives are unrealistic, or you don't know how to measure what you're trying to do, because you can't be that low and implement any kind of program. Have I engaged a third party to evaluate my program? So you can go out and you can find consultants that can come in and look at your program. Are you really managing the emails? Or are you really managing all your content? Are there better ways of doing it? Because typically, unless you've had several experiences implementing a records management solution, you don't have the breadth of understanding all the different things that records management means. And so having outside consultants who have done this and have, you have to vet the consultant, but you want to find consultants that have actually implemented systems. Okay, that is the true experience that you're looking for. And what changes have I initiated that have improved the records management program? What am I doing all the time that I'm saying, okay, we got to change this. We got to improve this. I got to let information governance know that this isn't working out because of this, because their guidelines are not proper. Okay, because a lot of people in the information governance team, unless you're sitting at the table, don't really understand records management. They understand policy. They understand, we need to have the proper IT infrastructure to manage cybersecurity. But in terms of the records, they're a little bit further behind on that. And then finally, do I ever get my head above water to even think about this? And in some cases, we never do. It's so overwhelming. You're so limited in terms of resources. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Okay, so we get to the let us help you help yourself. And in this particular session, I want to talk about IT and records management's next frontier. And what I mean by that is, as a records manager, the thing that you need to do, if you haven't done this already, is get very, very, very well versed in terms of IT, because you will start blending into that organization, is what we're seeing today. IT has a heavy hand in terms of how the records management programs are implemented, if they're successful, the time frames in which they're implemented, the resources to help you, especially if if you're not an isolated system, and you never are. You are being fed by other IT managed systems, email, Word or file shares, SharePoint, Oracle Financial Systems, SAP, HR systems, PeopleSoft. Those systems are creating records that you have to capture. And if everything is about printing the record and scanning it back into the records management system, it probably ain't going to work that well. The physical records you had pretty much total control over to a great extent. But the electronic records just changes the landscape tremendously. So here are the things that you be aware of, that you'll probably, if you can educate and become a little bit more versed in these areas, I think it'll help you immensely in terms of your position as a records manager. Security, okay, is obviously of utmost importance. You have infrastructure. What does it really mean? What does it mean I have different servers? What does it mean I have, can I get on-ramp servers or something similar to that from another vendor that allows me to make sure I process the information in a timely fashion? Permission access, I talked a little bit more, about that earlier in terms of how systems are implemented, so I know a reasonable time frame that all these permissions will be available, so the system's not floundering over 2 years and you still haven't implemented your system. Integration with other systems, again, to the legacy applications. Inventory assessment. What do I have out there? Where are these records coming from? And how am I going to get them into my system? And so this is a discussion that you can't have, unless you include IT. Social media access. So is this part of it's growing? The tweets, the Facebooks, all that stuff that are potential records in your organization, depending on the declaration and policy of your organization. How is that going to come in? That stuff is outside what's known as the firewall. All right, Facebook is outside your firewall. It's outside the wall that blocks the public to come in and take a look at whatever you have in your system. But if the content is created in the public, how is that going to tunnel in to your system? IT can help you with that. And then migration really means that, you may be, if you have a physical record system, okay, typically you're running off a spreadsheet or some, older product that is managing the physical records, the boxes, the distribution, the transmittal forms, et cetera, et cetera. And so when you move to a newer system, how do you migrate that? And how do you migrate content that might be in an email archive versus an email records management system? Or how do I migrate content from an older records management system for electronic? I want to move it into a new system. That migration stuff is work, and understanding that from an IT perspective will make you so much more valuable because you're going to ask the right questions. Okay, so that kind of wraps up a lot of the presentation for today. We're kind of going down to the end here. The check your sanity part is the Fife Records Management University community site. Not a lot of activity recently. I encourage you to go on there, present some information, ask some questions. It's a great forum to share with a lot of the people who participate in Records Management University. And that's the URL for it. Okay, so here's one of the recent community comments. I'll go through this very, very quickly. And I think a lot of you can relate to this. I'm a one-person team and a part-time scanner. We have a retention schedule, policies, electronic document management. But what good are they when no one knows what these are? So this is the kind of, you need to promote what these are is basically it. And that's another one of the challenges you have. You have to become, I would say, a mouseketeer, but a marketeer. They can go out there and promote what you're doing because it affects everybody in your organization. And this person says, I feel like I am constantly putting out day-to-day fires. She's not in California, thank God, and not have the opportunity to concentrate on being proactive in our records program and create audits of our records program, release of legal holds, and timely records destruction. Okay, so this goes to the III things that I presented earlier. How can I make the program better? What do I need to do? And you can only do so much. You only have so many hours in a day. You have to figure out what's the most important things to do. Okay, and then I want to get real quickly differentiation between email archiving and email records management. Email archiving really takes emails from your Exchange server or Google server or whatever servers you're using for mail in that case, and it takes them and it moves them into this archive. Now, all the archive is doing is storing them. It's almost like relieving Exchange of not having to store all the stuff in Exchange because it's expensive to do that. So it moves these emails kind of in bulk into your archive system. Now, that archive system is there for your users to go in and find emails that are no longer in your Exchange server. That's kind of its basic mission. Now, you can do a little bit of records management on it. You don't really categorize stuff. And the records manager for disposition is pretty much at the end of the year, let's get rid of all the emails that are in there from 5 years back. That's not true records management. That, in comparison to email records management, where it requires a migration, the journaling that I talked about, the email envelope journaling, to move those in real time, doesn't allow the user to make a declaration whether they're going to keep them or not because they're records. And it's totally under the control of the records management people. But it's not the system that you have as your backup for all the older emails that were in Exchange, because you don't want everybody in your organization coming into your records management system. It would overburden it just to kind of look for emails when emails are being journaled in all day long. So they are two different animals. And we run into a lot of people who have email archiving, but they don't really have an email records management, and that's their next step. And their next step is, how do I get my stuff out of the email archiving system, which can be done, extracted, and then put in and reprocessed the emails in terms of categorization, in terms of capstone, in terms of setting up the disposition schedules for those emails and finding stuff, the probable non-records as well. So it's almost like a reprocessing of the emails, but not in real time coming out of your Exchange server. Okay, upcoming events. Knowledge Management World, we're in Washington, D.C., November 5th. God, that's next week.
Yeah.
You can come and visit us and say hi.
And see Dean Mitch in person.
That's right.
He'll be wearing a hat, maybe not a jack-o'-lantern hat. But
for the people who went to the ARMA show last week or 2 weeks ago, we had a couple hundred people from RMU stop by. We took pictures, and we will present those pictures at our last class this semester.
Great.
So stick around so you can see yourself with me and Chris and just me. But anyway, and then the eDiscovery Records Information Management Conference is March 26th. Fife has DC Live, and I'll explain more about that as we get closer to that period sometime in the spring. And in August, God, I'm pushing this out pretty far. There's another show that we're at in Washington, D.C. There's also ARMA chapters that I'm talking to present locally. So you might see me somewhere else in the country with my pumpkin head. Okay, who's next on the couch? Records are important, but we need to first get our business cases under control. This is the Abraham Maslow class. A lot of people have heard of the Maslow hierarchy. It's one of my favorite things in the universe, and it really gives you an idea of how you get to this, penultimate position in the universe of what do I want? Self-esteem is really where it leads you to. And how do you get self-esteem when you're talking about records management? That's a challenge. Okay, so if there are any burning questions, you can present those to Chris in the chat right now, and we're going to try to put out those fires associated with it. So I'll give you a minute if anybody has any questions, Chris.
Dean Mitch, could you go back to the list of upcoming events?
Sure. I surely can do that. Ta-da-ta-da.
Great. And right now we're not getting a lot of questions.
Okay. That's fine. I'm exhausted. I want to eat some pumpkin pie. So anyway, look, I encourage you to throw them out there at the community, email to us, whatever, and we'll definitely try to get to them. Okay. So in closing, records management is not as scary as Halloween, and it shouldn't be. And hopefully these classes are allowing you to not fear records management. And it's an amazing technology. It really is. And it's the environment in which you work is so complex. And I've been in the industry 40 years, and as I've told people, this is the most complex implementations that I've ever done. And so don't get discouraged. Don't fear it. Address it, attack it, and you'll be fine. All right, Chris.
All right. Well,
wrap her up.
Yeah, there's no real questions from the group today. Thank you everybody for joining. Sorry for the minor technical issues in the beginning, but great audience as always. And hope everyone has a safe and fun Halloween. All right. Thanks, everybody.